Hello, and welcome to part 3 of our series on medieval Europe. Today, we will focus on the Black Death. You have probably heard of this virus under many different names: the Plague, the Black Death, and the Bubonic Plague, the Great Sickness maybe. And one of the reasons it has so many names is because there's more than one strain of sickness happening, and it all just gets lumped together and called the plague. The 3 strains, which we will go over more in gory detail later on, will all be hitting Europe between 1347 to 1350. The 3 strains are Septicemic, Pneumonic, and Bubonic. While historians debate over the actual number of people dying from the Black Death, most can agree that at least 1/3 of Europe's population will die as a result of these 3 plagues. Let's go back in time a little to set the stage and examine why all of this was able to happen in the first place. Between 1315 to 1317, there was a great famine in Europe. Europeans were not very smart about farming at this point in time and were using their maximum amount of farmland and not always rotating crops. So, their soil was depleted of nutrients. If you're using all of your available farmland, it's safe to say you can only ever make the same amount of food every year. Therefore, the population will be stagnant. You can't support more people, so you don't. Climate changes in Europe will produce 3 years of crop failures from 1315 to 1317 because of excessive rainfall. So, 3 years of failing crops, and there's no amount of grain stores that could hold up for 3 consecutive years. So the result is that 15% of the peasant population dies in most villages. When you hear about a food shortage, it isn't the wealthy or the middle class that will go without food completely, it's the peasants. But this food shortage does increase poverty. The food prices were so high that people had to pay most of their allowances towards food, and the nutritional value of the food was low. So this starvation and poverty will make people that live during this time more susceptible to disease, even if they didn't die from malnutrition. The plague is actually estimated to have originated in China in the early 1300s. We have record of the Mongols using plague-ridden corpses and flinging them at their enemies, which is one of the earliest accounts of biological warfare. Because the Mongols also stimulated Silk Road trade, China had a thriving trade industry, which allowed for ships from China to make it all the way to Europe. Something worth noting is that the plague will spread in Asia and the Middle East as well, due to their contact with people carrying the disease. But it will affect Europe the most, which is why we are so Eurocentric when we talk about it. Scientists now think that the plague came from mutilated bacteria that developed in China in the early 1300s and was able to spread via the fleas on the rats that boarded the Chinese trade ships. These ships will reach Italy as early as 1347. The rats themselves were immune to the disease, so they didn't get sick, but the cities provided plenty of places for fleas to get off and on their rat hosts. The disease, once it makes contact with people, spreads fast. Within days of the ship's arrival, people all around town were dropping dead. The scary part was, no one knew what was happening or how to prevent it from happening to them. Many people thought it was a punishment sent from God. Let's look at the 3 types of plague and how they were all working together. The Bubonic Plague is the most common form of the 3, which is why you often hear the Black Death referred to as the Bubonic Plague. This strain would take up to 6 days to show itself. Imagine how many people you come into contact with in 6 days' worth of time, and each one of them now has been exposed to the germs. The plague germs jump into your white blood cells that are sent by the body to kill off invading germs. Then they travel to your nearest lymph glands, which are usually around the neck or arm. The lymph gland fills with blood and pus and forms these large buboes, or blackish lumps that swell up from the body. I have some gruesome pictures coming up on the next screen. About 60% of people infected with this strain died. Here are some examples of buboes. As you can see, they are quite large and painful. The most common attempt to cure them came from lancing them, which basically means they tried to pop it like a pimple and clean it out. But since they didn't have very hygienic cleaning techniques, this didn't work very well, and often just led to infection. In the pneumonic strand, germs enter the white blood cells and go directly to the lungs. This results in victims having a terrible cough that would spray blood and the disease. So if people didn't cover their cough, which most did not, then it infected the people that happened to be near them. This strain took about 3 days before symptoms would appear. After you contracted the cough, victims would run a high fever, which eventually put them into a coma, and then they would die. There is no life support, of course, to maintain coma victims, so most coma victims would die very soon after entering the coma. Since there was no way to revive them once they entered the coma, and without food and water their bodies could not sustain life, this was the most deadly of all the plagues. So it's more related probably to the coma itself than to the plague necessarily, but almost 100% of the people with this strain died. The third strand is the Septicemic Plague, and it's not found as often as the other two strains. Bacteria inside the white blood cells is able to release directly into the bloodstream, so it's literally all over your body and not confined to a specific location. It would appear as a rash that shows up all over the body, and the person would die within a day of seeing the rash, so that's probably why it did sooner than the other two. And this form of plague was always fatal. As you can see from the chart, the plague hit all major countries in Europe and affected some more than others. Countries with a higher population density and larger cities were more greatly affected than those with more rural settings. You can also see from this chart that this will not be the last time the plague strikes Europe. It will come again in the 1450s, but due to a few people building up immunity to the disease, it will not kill quite as many people as it did the first time around. There were several proposed cures for the plagues over time, basically none of which would actually make you healthier. The people of the medieval times had a great aversion to bathing. They didn't want to take a bath for a few reasons. One is that they saw bathing as a sign of vanity. They thought that if you took too much pride in your personal appearance, then God would punish you for being vain, and then you might get the plague. They also believed that bathing washed off the good germs and would leave you susceptible to getting sick. Colognes and perfumes were very popular during this time because everyone smelled so bad because they weren't bathing. Flowers during weddings developed for this reason as well, not because it was pretty, but because the bride smelled, and the flowers hid it. And they would also try to lance Buboes, as we talked about earlier, as a cure for the plague. This would be extremely painful, as they had no way to numb the area. Doctors during the plague wore the creepy outfits pictured in the image on the right. The mask that they had worn had a beak-like look to them, where they would put herbs and flowers to help hide the smell of the people they were trying to cure. Remember, there was also a belief that the plague could be spread by smells, so this was also important for that purpose as well. Man, I'm really glad that we know more about science now. Another cure proposed by religious communities was that the plague was brought on by your sins, and to atone for those sins, you could perform self-flagellation, which is basically just beating yourself. As you can imagine, this also did nothing to help the spread of the disease. As you can imagine, with 1/3 or more of the population dying within 3 years, the average person saw and experienced a lot of death in their daily life. There were daily collections of bodies in mass grave sites, and cremations were common, as grave diggers could not keep up with the demand to dig individual graves. Art during this time period reflects that trend. As you can see from the pictures on the screen, skeletons become a fixture in the art during this time period. You also get this theme that death is triumphant, and overall will always win. I mean, it's pretty morbid. There are two major long-term effects of the plague for Europe. The first is the collapse of the feudal system. The system is based off of the idea that you will always have an abundance of working serfs and peasants. But as the plague starts to take effect, the social structure of medieval Europe gets all messed up. One quote I've always liked about the plague is that the Black Death does not discriminate. It didn't matter how rich or poor you were.